In the luxurious, sprawling lobby of the high-profile yacht auction, a hush fell over the crowd as she stepped in. The black CEO, a towering figure of success and sophistication, immediately caught the eyes of everyone around her. Her black, tailored dress was impeccably cut, the kind of sharpness that suggested she was a force to be reckoned with. But as she moved forward, there was an unmistakable chill in the air, a strange tension, as if the room itself was holding its breath. She was here for the deal of a lifetime, but there was one thing she didn't know: the door had already been closed to her, even before she entered. The private auction, an exclusive event for the elite, had a secret: not all were welcomed inside, especially if they didn't fit the right mold. She was about to face a rude awakening, one that would not only shake her confidence but force her to confront the ugly truth of racial bias that had lurked behind the glittering facade of wealth and power. As the whispers began to swirl, a cold realization hit her: her presence was not wanted, not here, not by them. And for a fleeting moment, she questioned everything she had worked for. Was this what success in this world really meant? Was she truly equal, or was she just an outsider playing a game she could never win? Before she could fully process the implications, the auctioneer's assistant approached her with a practiced, almost condescending smile. "I'm afraid we can't let you in," he said coolly. The word stung, each syllable carrying with it a history of exclusion, of barriers built by those who never intended to see her succeed. She stood there, speechless, the weight of his dismissal sinking in. But then, something in her snapped. This was not the end. It was only the beginning. Seconds later, the assistant turned away, his words hanging in the air like an insult she couldn't shake. She wasn't sure if the bile rising in her throat was from anger or disbelief, but something deep inside her told her not to let it go. As the door to the auction hall closed behind her, 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind. She was no stranger to challenges. She had risen from the bottom, had fought tooth and nail to make it to the top. But this? This was something entirely different. She wasn't just being challenged, she was being rejected, not for her skills or expertise, but for something as immutable as the color of her skin. As she stepped away from the entrance, her mind churned. She knew she couldn't let this go unnoticed. Not in a world where people like her, like all of them, fought so hard just to have a seat at the table. She took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. No more would she play the role of the grateful minority. No more would she shrink in the face of discrimination. She would make sure the world knew exactly what had happened today. And as she moved toward the exit, her resolve solidified: this injustice would not go unchallenged. In the luxurious, sprawling lobby of the high-profile yacht auction, a hush fell over the crowd as she stepped in. The black CEO, a towering figure of success and sophistication, immediately caught the eyes of everyone around her. Her black, tailored dress was impeccably cut, the kind of sharpness that suggested she was a force to be reckoned with. But as she moved forward, there was an unmistakable chill in the air, a strange tension, as if the room itself was holding its breath. She was here for the deal of a lifetime, but there was one thing she didn't know: the door had been closed to her even before she tried to enter. The private auction, an exclusive event for the elite, had a secret: not all were welcomed inside, especially if they didn't fit the right mold. She was about to face a rude awakening, one that would not only shake her confidence but force her to confront the ugly truth of racial bias that had lurked behind the glittering facade of wealth and power. As the whispers began to swirl, a cold realization hit her: her presence was not wanted, not here, not by them. And for a fleeting moment, she questioned everything she had worked for. Was this what success in this world really meant? Was she truly equal, or was she just an outsider playing a game she could never win? Before she could fully process the implications, the auctioneer's assistant approached her with a practiced, almost condescending smile. "I'm afraid we can't let you in," he said coolly. The word stung, each syllable carrying with it a history of exclusion, of barriers built by those who never intended to see her succeed. She stood there, speechless, the weight of his dismissal sinking in. But then, something inside her snapped. This was not the end. It was only the beginning. Seconds later, the assistant turned away, his words hanging in the air like an insult she couldn't shake. She wasn't sure if the bile rising in her throat was from anger or disbelief, but something deep inside her told her not to let it go. As the door to the auction hall closed behind her, 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind. She was no stranger to challenges. She had risen from the bottom, had fought tooth and nail to make it to the top. But this? This was something entirely different. She wasn't just being challenged, she was being rejected, not for her skills or expertise, but for something as immutable as the color of her skin. As she stepped away from the entrance, her mind churned. She knew she couldn't let this go unnoticed. Not in a world where people like her, like all of them, fought so hard just to have a seat at the table. She took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. No more would she play the role of the grateful minority. No more would she shrink in the face of discrimination. She would make sure the world knew exactly what had happened today. And as she moved toward the exit, her resolve solidified, this injustice would not go unchallenged. The cold air outside was nothing compared to the chill that had settled in her chest. As she walked away from the entrance, her heels clicked sharply against the marble floor, each step echoing in the empty hallway like a metronome counting down the moments before her next move. But this wasn't just anger or frustration, this was something deeper. This was betrayal. The same old story, just with a new face and a shiny coat of glittering wealth. She had fought for every inch of ground she had gained in this industry, only to be reminded that no matter how high she climbed, there would always be those who would shut the door in her face simply because of her skin color. The auction was supposed to be a breakthrough, a chance to solidify her place among the power players, a chance to prove once and for all that she wasn't just a token, but a force to be reckoned with. But now? Now she was standing on the outside looking in, watching the doors swing closed behind her like they had for so many others who looked like her. She was tired of fighting a battle that seemed unwinnable, tired of pretending that she could change a system that had been built to exclude people like her from the start. But as the frustration threatened to overtake her, she felt a spark of something else, something sharper. It wasn't defeat. It was determination. She had never been one to back down, and she wasn't about to start now. She had come too far, fought too hard, to let this moment define her. She turned on her heel, determined not to let this injustice go unchallenged. She would find a way in, even if it meant taking the fight directly to those who thought they could shut her out. She was no longer interested in playing by their rules. She would make them change the game. She pulled out her phone, quickly typing a message to her assistant. Contact my legal team. Prepare for a press statement. We're going to make sure everyone knows what happened here today. The message was sent before she even had time to second-guess it. She didn't need approval or permission, she was done asking for a seat at the table. She would take her seat. She would force them to recognize her. As she moved toward the exit, she noticed a familiar face standing near the valet. It was one of the other CEOs who had been in the auction room. He had been watching her when she had tried to enter, his expression neutral but cold. She had seen that look before, the one that said she didn't belong, the one that silently communicated, "You're not one of us." He wasn't the one who had turned her away, but he had been complicit in her exclusion. Her eyes locked with his, and for a moment, the world seemed to slow down. He didn't look away, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a mix of guilt and recognition, as though he had seen something in her that he hadn't wanted to acknowledge. Without breaking eye contact, she walked past him, her body rigid with purpose. He didn't say a word. But she didn't need him to. His silence was the confirmation she needed. It wasn't just the assistant who had denied her, it was a system, a network of power brokers who had decided long ago that she didn't fit the mold. And that was something she would change. The ride to her office felt longer than usual, each minute stretching out as the weight of what had just happened hung over her. Her mind raced, replaying the scene at the yacht auction over and over again. She couldn't shake the feeling of humiliation that had crept in when the assistant had turned her away, but it wasn't just about being rejected from the auction. It was about something deeper, something that had followed her throughout her entire career, an unspoken barrier that she had worked so hard to ignore, but one that was impossible to miss now. The stark reality was clear: no matter how successful she became, no matter how much power or influence she accumulated, there were people who would always see her as other, as someone who didn't belong in their world. She had worked tirelessly to break through that barrier, to prove that she wasn't just a diversity hire, that she wasn't just a token for some corporate diversity quota. She had earned every accolade, every recognition, and yet here she was, once again being reminded that there was a line she could never fully cross. She could feel her blood begin to boil as she thought about it. The anger was familiar, a fire that had always burned just beneath the surface. It was the same anger that had pushed her to become one of the youngest CEOs in her industry, the same anger that had propelled her through every challenge, every obstacle. But this time, it felt different. It wasn't just personal frustration, it was a challenge to everything she had worked for. This was bigger than her. This was about every person who had ever been shut out, every person who had been forced to play by someone else's rules, someone else's definition of success. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for all of them. As her car pulled into the parking lot, she already knew what she had to do. She had to fight back. She wasn't going to let this go unanswered. She would use her platform, her position, to expose the systemic issues that had led to this moment, to force change where it was most needed. She wasn't going to let the powerful, the privileged, continue to operate behind closed doors, making decisions that affected people's lives without ever facing the consequences of their actions. She stepped out of the car, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement, each step purposeful and determined. The office doors slid open as she entered, and her assistant was already waiting for her, his face unreadable. "I want a meeting with my legal team." "Now," she said, her voice firm and controlled. "We're going public. It's time to make some noise." Her assistant nodded, already dialing the phone to set things in motion. She had made up her mind. She would not let them dictate the terms of her success. The system was broken, and it was time to burn it down. As she entered her office, she walked to her desk and looked out the window, her mind focused. She was about to do something that would shake the foundation of everything she had worked for, but she didn't care. It was time to change the game. The meeting with her legal team was tense, to say the least. As she sat at the head of the conference table, her team's faces were a mixture of concern and determination. They all knew what this meant, a public battle, the kind that could potentially destroy reputations and shake the foundations of the powerful elite she was up against. But none of them could see the fire burning inside her. This wasn't just about winning a case or proving a point, this was about something far more personal. It was about justice, about reclaiming her narrative in a world that had always tried to keep her in the margins. "We need to act fast," she said, her voice unwavering. "This isn't just a corporate issue. This is bigger than the auction or the people who shut me out today. This is about the system that lets these things happen behind closed doors, that lets them think they can dictate who belongs and who doesn't. I won't stand for it any longer." Her lawyer, a seasoned professional who had handled high-profile cases before, nodded gravely. "We'll need to gather evidence, make a case, and prepare a strategy to push back. We could go public with the details and risk a backlash, or we could try to negotiate with the stakeholders and force a change internally." She shook her head. "No negotiation. No more silence. I want to expose this for what it is, systemic discrimination. I'll put a spotlight on everything. I want the press involved. I want everyone to know exactly how I was treated today, and why it's unacceptable." The room fell silent for a moment as the gravity of her words sank in. One of her senior advisors, a younger associate who had been working with her for less than a year, spoke up hesitantly. "Are you sure about this? Going public will make things messy. People are going to be asking questions. It's not just the auction we're talking about. We're talking about an entire network of power players who won't take this lightly." She leaned forward, her gaze fixed on the young associate, and for the first time, her expression softened. "I know it will be messy. But nothing worthwhile is ever easy. This fight is bigger than my reputation, bigger than this company. This is for every person who has been shut out for no reason other than their race, their gender, their identity. We've been conditioned to be quiet, to accept the status quo, but I'm done with that. I'm going to force change, and if that means disrupting the whole system, so be it." The room was still, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. Her legal team exchanged looks, the tension palpable. They knew this wasn't just another corporate PR stunt or high-profile case, this was personal. It was about a fight for equality, for a seat at the table that she had earned and deserved. They all nodded in agreement. They were with her, every step of the way. As she stood up from the table, she felt a surge of power, a new clarity of purpose. This was no longer just a battle over an auction or an individual slight, it was a declaration of war on an entire system that had been built to exclude people like her. And she would tear it down, piece by piece, until it could no longer stand. The following days were a whirlwind of preparation, media strategy, and legal maneuvers. Her team worked around the clock, gathering information, preparing documents, and setting up interviews with key journalists. Every move was calculated, every word carefully chosen. She wasn't going to let this be a one-time story, this was going to be the start of something much bigger. She needed to make sure that the world saw exactly what had happened to her, not just the incident at the auction, but the larger, insidious patterns of discrimination that plagued the corporate world. She knew that to truly make an impact, she had to go beyond just her own story. She had to show how widespread the issue was, how many people had been quietly shut out, forced to fight for opportunities that were never given to them in the first place. Her first public statement was a carefully crafted message, delivered via a press conference that was broadcast live. She stood tall at the podium, her voice steady but filled with conviction. Today, I am not just speaking for myself. I am speaking for every individual who has been denied access, who has been told that they are not enough, simply because of their race, their gender, or the color of their skin. I am here to say that this is not just my fight, this is our fight, for fairness, for equality, and for the recognition that we all deserve. The door that was closed to me is not just a door that was closed to one person, it is a symbol of the doors that have been closed to so many others like me. And it is time for those doors to be opened. The media coverage was immediate, and the response was overwhelming. The story spread like wildfire, and before long, news outlets were picking up the story, airing it across national television. The reaction from the public was mixed, some stood with her, applauding her courage to speak out, while others tried to diminish her claims, suggesting that she was overreacting or misinterpreting the situation. But she didn't care about the doubters. She knew that for every critic, there were countless others who had been silently suffering, just like she had. The more attention the story got, the more people came forward, sharing their own experiences of exclusion and discrimination. It wasn't long before she began receiving messages from others in similar situations, thanking her for speaking out, for giving them a voice they had long been denied. She felt a fire ignite within her. This wasn't just about getting revenge on the people who had turned her away, this was about something much bigger, something that could change the way the entire industry operated. Her team worked quickly to set up interviews with key influencers, business leaders, and politicians who could help push the conversation forward. She wasn't going to stop until she had reached the highest levels of power, until the people who made these decisions could no longer hide behind their wealth and privilege. But as the story continued to gain momentum, so did the pressure. She began receiving threats, anonymous calls, and emails from people who were determined to shut her down. They told her to stop, to let it go, that it wasn't worth the fight. But she refused to be intimidated. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about everyone who had ever been pushed to the sidelines, told they didn't belong. It was about the power to take control of her own narrative, to reclaim her place in the world. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she also knew that if she stopped now, nothing would ever change. So, she pressed on, her resolve hardening with each passing day. As the weeks passed, the pressure mounted, but so did the momentum. Her campaign had ignited a fire that was burning brightly across the media, and what began as a personal battle quickly evolved into a movement. More and more people, from various industries and backgrounds, reached out to her, sharing their own stories of exclusion, subtle and overt racism, and the barriers that they had encountered in their own careers. These were stories that had been buried for far too long, stories that had never been given a voice. And now, they had found one. She began to understand the magnitude of what she had set in motion. What had started as a response to her own mistreatment was now a collective voice demanding change, and it was impossible to ignore. With the media's continued focus on her story, her influence grew, and soon she was being invited to speak at conferences, participate in high-level panels, and meet with top influencers who wanted to be part of the conversation. She was no longer just the CEO of a successful company, she had become a symbol, the face of the fight against systemic racial discrimination in business. But with this newfound power came new challenges. The backlash was fierce. There were whispers among the power players who had long been in charge, and they weren't pleased with how things were unfolding. Some of them reached out directly, offering her opportunities to resolve the issue quietly, talks behind closed doors, away from the public eye. They wanted her to stop pushing, to stop challenging the system that had kept them in power for so long. She knew exactly what they were doing, trying to buy her silence, trying to manipulate her into backing down. But she wasn't the same woman she had been when she first stepped into the auction house. She had seen the power of her own voice, and she was not going to let it be silenced by their threats. The calls and messages grew more aggressive, the pressure more intense, but she remained unshaken. She understood that the moment she backed down would be the moment her cause lost its strength. She had started this fight not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been forced to the sidelines, for everyone who had been told they didn't belong. She was determined to make sure that their voices, too, would be heard. She stood firm in her convictions, knowing that this was a battle she could not afford to lose. And yet, even as she fought the external battles with the corporate elite, there were moments when doubt would creep in. The loneliness of the fight began to take its toll. It was one thing to be in the public eye, surrounded by cameras and flashing lights, but it was another thing entirely to feel the weight of an entire movement on her shoulders. Her team stood by her, offering support and guidance, but there were nights when she lay awake, questioning whether she was truly making a difference, whether the fight was worth it. But in those moments of uncertainty, she would think back to that day at the auction, to the moment when she had been denied entry, and the fire inside her would reignite. She would remind herself that this was not just about her. This was about breaking down the walls that had kept so many people from realizing their full potential, about creating a world where no one had to fight just to be seen. And so, she pressed on. Each step more resolute than the last, knowing that the path ahead would not be easy, but it was one she was prepared to walk. As the pressure from her adversaries grew, so did her resolve. She began to realize that the fight was no longer just about her own story, it had become a battle for the very future of business, for the lives of countless people who had been left behind, ignored, and silenced for too long. The media attention had reached a fever pitch, with stories of systemic racism in corporate spaces becoming a daily headline. But along with the spotlight came the relentless scrutiny. Journalists, influencers, and even critics began to dissect every aspect of her past, every decision she had ever made. They combed through her history, searching for any mistake, any flaw, that they could use to discredit her. It was exhausting. There were moments when the weight of it all threatened to break her. But with each attack, she stood taller. She refused to be defined by their standards, refused to let them tear her down. She had learned to become bulletproof, not in her actions, but in her mindset. There were nights when she lay awake, her mind racing, filled with questions about the toll this fight would take on her personal life. Her family had always been a source of strength, but they, too, felt the strain of the public eye. There were calls for privacy, a demand for peace from loved ones who feared for her safety. But she knew that she couldn't back down now. This wasn't just a corporate battle, it was a cultural one. And for her to win, for change to truly take hold, she would have to push through the pain, the exhaustion, and the doubt. The days grew longer, but the more the story spread, the more support she gained. It wasn't just the black community that rallied behind her, it was people of all races, ages, and backgrounds, anyone who had ever felt the sting of discrimination. They saw her as a symbol of resistance, a beacon of hope in a world that often seemed determined to keep them in their place. It wasn't easy, though. The corporate giants she had called colleagues were now turning their backs on her, trying to distance themselves from the controversy she had stirred up. It didn't matter how many times she had helped them climb the ladder, how many deals they had signed together, she was no longer seen as one of them. She was the threat, the disruptor, the one who had dared to expose their dirty secrets. But it wasn't just the high-powered executives who turned on her, it was also the voices that came from her own industry, the people who were supposed to understand her struggle the most. Her own peers, many of them black like her, began to distance themselves from her cause, afraid of the backlash it would bring. Some told her she was being too loud, too visible, too angry. They told her to be patient, to wait for change to come slowly, to work within the system instead of against it. But patience wasn't going to get the job done. She wasn't interested in gradual progress, she wanted real change, and she was willing to fight for it. So, she kept pushing, even when it seemed like the world was pushing back harder. The legal team had prepared the next round of press releases, and they were ready to call out the auction house, the so-called elite, and the entire system for their role in maintaining this culture of exclusion. As the next round of press conferences loomed, she knew the stakes had never been higher. This was her moment, not just to change her own life, but to change the system for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. And she would make sure they all knew it. The days leading up to the next round of press conferences were filled with a mix of anticipation and anxiety. She had already received numerous calls from high-powered individuals, some trying to negotiate a settlement, others trying to convince her to drop the entire campaign. They didn't understand, or perhaps they did, but they thought she could be bought, just like so many others. But she wasn't in it for the money or the corporate perks anymore, she was in it for the people who had been silenced, for those whose voices had never been heard. She was done playing by the rules of a system that was rigged from the start. The morning of the press conference arrived, and the room was buzzing with reporters, cameras, and eager questions. She felt the weight of the moment, but also the power of it. Today wasn't just another media appearance, it was her moment to break free from the chains that had held her back for so long. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and stepped onto the stage. The room fell into silence as she walked to the podium, her eyes scanning the crowd of journalists and photographers. She knew exactly what she was about to say, but the gravity of the situation made her pause for a brief moment. She had never imagined that it would come to this, that her personal battle would spark a movement, but now there was no turning back. She had already crossed that line. I stand here today not as an individual, but as a representative of every person who has ever been told they didn't belong, she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. Today, I am here to speak not just for myself, but for the countless others who have been excluded, who have been forced to fight for a seat at the table, only to have that seat yanked away once they got close enough. Her words were met with a mixture of silence and murmurs from the crowd, but she pressed on. The incident that occurred at the yacht auction is just one example of a much larger problem, one that we all know exists but continue to pretend isn't there. It's a system that shuts out people of color, women, and anyone who doesn't fit the so-called mold of what a successful person should look like. It's a system that rewards conformity and punishes anyone who dares to challenge it. But I am done being silent. I am done pretending that this is okay. It is not okay, and it never will be. The room was dead silent now, every eye on her. This fight isn't just about me, it's about all of us. It's about our right to be seen, to be valued, and to have an equal opportunity to succeed. I will not rest until we tear down these walls of exclusion and create a world where everyone has the chance to thrive, regardless of the color of their skin, their gender, or their background. This is our moment. And I won't stop until we have one. As she finished, the room erupted into applause. But she knew that this was just the beginning. The real work was still ahead of her. She had put a target on her back, and the powerful elite who had once welcomed her with open arms were now her fiercest adversaries. They wouldn't give up easily, but neither would she. This was the fight of a lifetime, and she was ready to see it through to the end. The aftermath of the press conference was a whirlwind. The media coverage exploded, and her words became a rallying cry for those who had felt the sting of discrimination for far too long. Her phone rang constantly with messages of support and outrage, but also with threats, warnings, and demands to back down. She knew that the people who had tried to silence her would not go down without a fight. The backlash had begun, and it was swift and brutal. The corporate world, especially those at the top, were not used to being challenged, and they would stop at nothing to maintain their grip on power. Some of her former colleagues began to publicly disassociate themselves from her, claiming they had no idea the auction was biased or that such a thing could happen in their industry. They played the part of the innocent bystanders, distancing themselves from the controversy, as if they had no hand in the system that had kept people like her on the outside for so long. But she wasn't fooled. She knew exactly what they were doing. They were trying to shift the blame, to make themselves look like the victims, and to protect their positions at the top of the food chain. But it didn't matter. She had already made it clear that this wasn't about the auction, or the people who had denied her entry. This was about a larger issue, one that reached far beyond a single event. The next step in her fight was crucial. She had to go beyond the corporate elite and bring the issue to the public, to the masses, to those who had never had a voice in the room. She began meeting with grassroots organizations, with activists who had been fighting for equality long before her. They understood the battle better than anyone, and together, they began to map out a plan to take the movement nationwide. She wasn't interested in just changing the policies of one auction house or a few high-profile companies. She wanted to create lasting, systemic change. The world needed to know that the old way of doing business, where power was concentrated in the hands of a few, where those on the outside were left to fight for scraps, was coming to an end. The more she spoke, the more she realized that the battle was not just for recognition but for the future. If she could succeed, if she could tear down the barriers that had kept her and so many others from entering these spaces, then the next generation would have a fighting chance. It wasn't just about her career, it was about the future of an entire industry, about ensuring that no one else would have to endure the same challenges she had faced. But as she built her coalition and prepared for the next phase of her campaign, she felt the pressure mounting. Every move she made was being watched, every word she spoke was dissected, and the stakes had never been higher. She knew that the road ahead would not be easy, that there would be sacrifices, but she also knew that she was in the right. She had the truth on her side, and she was prepared to use it as a weapon. No matter how hard the opposition pushed back, no matter how much they tried to break her, she would keep fighting. This was her fight, and she would see it through to the end. As the days passed, the movement she had sparked continued to grow. The press coverage remained intense, with stories popping up in major news outlets and social media platforms. Her words had resonated with so many people, and the momentum was undeniable. But with the public support came increasing pressure from the corporate world, and the backlash reached new heights. The boardrooms of the top companies were buzzing with concerns over the public relations nightmare she had become, and her refusal to back down was causing a ripple effect across the industry. Executives, who had once praised her for her innovation and leadership, were now retreating to their ivory towers, looking for ways to distance themselves from her. Some tried to negotiate, offering her deals that were more about preserving their own interests than addressing the real issues. But she saw through it all. She wasn't interested in making deals with people who had built their empires on the backs of exclusion. Horror. Fight was not about personal gain, it was about leveling the playing field, about dismantling a system that had kept people like her and so many others from having the same opportunities. She had no intention of stopping until she saw real change. The pressure from the opposition grew stronger, and soon her legal team advised her that the next phase of the battle would be a defining moment. The lawsuits against the auction house and several major corporations were moving forward, but it wasn't enough. She needed to take the fight to the streets, to the people, to make them see the truth of what was happening behind closed doors. It was time for a nationwide campaign. With the help of activists, influencers, and allies from all walks of life, she began to organize rallies, marches, and town hall meetings. Her message was clear: this wasn't just about one incident or one auction, it was about an entire system of power and privilege that needed to be torn down. Her face became a symbol of resistance, a beacon of hope for anyone who had ever been marginalized, dismissed, or forgotten. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for the future, for the generations to come who would no longer have to face the same barriers. But as the campaign gained more traction, the opposition pushed back even harder. The media began to turn on her, spinning the narrative in ways that questioned her motives and character. They painted her as an extremist, someone who was threatening the stability of the system, someone who was trying to upend the very fabric of corporate America. They tried to paint her as the villain. But she refused to let their lies define her. She stood tall, continuing to speak out, continuing to expose the truth, no matter how hard they tried to silence her. Every rally, every speech, every interview was another opportunity to make her case. She wasn't just making noise, she was making history. As the movement grew, so did the pressure. She received anonymous threats, but they only fueled her determination. She knew the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, but there was no turning back now. She had started something that could never be undone, and no matter how hard they tried to break her, she would not back down. This fight, this battle for justice, had become her life's work, and she was prepared to see it through, no matter the cost. The battle was far from over, and as the legal proceedings continued, so did the tension. She had become a lightning rod for both support and criticism, and the weight of her position was beginning to take its toll. Every day brought new challenges, new obstacles designed to make her question whether this fight was worth the personal cost. Yet, the deeper she delved into the campaign, the more she realized that backing down was not an option. She had already come too far, and the momentum of the movement was too powerful to stop now. Her office was filled with calls from political leaders, activists, and business moguls, all wanting to offer their support, or in some cases, their advice. Some told her to take the high road, to back off, to avoid further damaging the corporate world's fragile image. But she was not interested in saving face for people who had never cared about her or her community in the first place. She was in this to win, not for her own sake, but for everyone who had ever been silenced, overlooked, or excluded. As the next round of legal filings approached, she began to notice a shift in the way the media was covering her. No longer was she just the story of a black CEO who had been denied access to a yacht auction. Now, she was becoming a symbol of resilience, of someone who was not afraid to confront the system head-on. But this shift also brought with it its own set of challenges. With the spotlight shining brighter on her, came even more invasive questions and attacks. The trolls on social media became louder, the critics more vicious. They tried to paint her as someone seeking revenge, someone bitter and angry. They twisted her words, misrepresented her motives, and made her seem like a villain. But she had learned to ignore the noise. She knew what the truth was. The truth was that she was fighting for something much bigger than herself. She was fighting for a future where no one else had to endure the same kind of discrimination she had faced. The truth was that the system needed to change, and she would not stop until it did. The legal team had laid the groundwork for a public hearing, one that would bring the auction house and several of the powerful companies involved to the forefront. It would be her chance to make her case, to force the people who had been hiding behind their wealth and influence to confront the consequences of their actions. The stakes were higher than they had ever been, but she was ready. She had prepared herself for this moment for months, and now she knew she couldn't afford to falter. Her mind was clear, her resolve stronger than ever. It was time to bring the fight directly to those who had tried to shut her down, to those who had believed they could maintain the status quo by silencing her. She would no longer be ignored. As the day of the hearing approached, the pressure mounted, but so did her sense of purpose. She was no longer just a CEO, she was a leader, a force for change, and no matter what happened in that courtroom, she knew that she had already won the battle for her own soul. The war for justice was still raging, but she was ready to finish it. This was her moment to make history, and she would not let it slip away. The day of the hearing arrived, and the weight of the moment settled heavily on her shoulders. This was not just a legal battle, it was a defining moment, not only for her but for every person who had been marginalized or excluded from the corridors of power. The courtroom was packed with reporters, lawyers, and industry insiders, all waiting to hear the arguments, to see how the powerful would respond to the challenge she had laid before them. She had come this far not just as a businesswoman, but as a symbol of resistance, the personification of the fight for equality in an industry that had long been resistant to change. As she walked into the courtroom, she felt the eyes of everyone on her. The room fell silent, and she could almost feel the tension in the air, thick and palpable. This was her moment to speak the truth, to expose the layers of deception that had allowed such discrimination to thrive unchecked for so long. She took her seat at the table, feeling the weight of the responsibility she had taken on, but also a strange calmness. She knew this was her fight, her cause, and she was not about to let the opposition intimidate her. The hearing began with formalities, the usual legal jargon, but then came the moment when she was called to the stand. As she stood, there was a palpable shift in the room. This was the moment of truth. She walked to the witness chair, her back straight, her eyes steady. The lawyers for the opposition tried to break her resolve with questions designed to undermine her, to paint her as a radical, a troublemaker. They asked about her past, about her career, about why she was so determined to speak out. They tried to distract from the core issue, racial discrimination, and instead, they attempted to deflect, to diminish her. But she wasn't swayed. With each question, she answered with the same unwavering confidence that had gotten her this far. She spoke of the exclusion she had faced, of the doors that had been slammed in her face, not because of her abilities or qualifications, but because of the color of her skin. She spoke of the countless other people who had been denied the same opportunities, people whose voices had never been heard. Her voice, calm but firm, rang out in the courtroom, and for a moment, the world outside seemed to fade. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was the fight of all those who had been forced to the sidelines. And as she sat there, facing the very system that had tried to silence her, she knew one thing for certain: they had underestimated her. This was the moment she would prove them all wrong. The battle wasn't over, but she had already won. Not in the courtroom, not in the eyes of the powerful, but in her own heart. She had done what she set out to do. She had challenged the system, forced it to confront its darkest truths, and shown the world that even the most powerful walls could be cracked. She had become a force to be reckoned with, and there was no turning back now. The fight would continue, but she was no longer just a participant. She was a leader, a trailblazer, and nothing would stop her from breaking down the barriers that had held back so many for far too long.